Hello, everybody. My name's Steve, and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. The Greek philosopher Plato said, "Necessity is the mother of invention." Nearly 2,000 years later, Thomas Edison quipped, "Invention is 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration." Oddly enough, Edison probably made this observation about the same time Ephraim Shay was developing the locomotive that would one day bear his name. While Shay's early life didn't foreshadow that of an inventor, the locomotive he invented out of necessity would revolutionize the logging industry and become a mainstay of motive power and many others. So coming up next, we'll take a look at the Shay geared locomotive on American Steam Legacy. The life story of Ephraim Shay is worthy of a video of its own, so we'll only be touching on the highlights. Shay is well known for working in many occupations, but contrary to popular belief, practicing medicine was not one of them. His formal training was as a teacher, a career he pursued while living in New Jersey in the years leading up to the American Civil War. During this period, Shay would spend his free time looking for farmland in the upper Midwest. His travels through Michigan and Ohio led him to Peoria, Illinois in 1861. With the southern states already leaving the Union, Shay learned of a new Army regiment being formed in St. Louis, Missouri. Shay signed up for a 3-year enlistment and was assigned to Company D, 8th Regiment of the Missouri Volunteer Infantry. While serving in the Union Army, Shay worked as a medical steward in the hospital corps. This may explain why some believe he practiced medicine. After being discharged from the Army in 1864, Shay worked as a county clerk in Michigan for several years before becoming a sawmill operator in 1869. In 1873, Shay moved to the Manistee River Basin in Michigan and established his own sawmill. It was Shay's foray into the lumber industry that planted the seeds for a better method of moving logs out of the forest and to the sawmills. In the 1870s, logging operations in the upper Midwest used horse-drawn sleds to move the lumber. The harvesting of trees took place during the winter months so that the snow cover could be used to build ice roads over which the sleds were moved. Shay came to realize that 73% of the cost of lumber came from transportation, specifically the labor to build and maintain the ice roads. The Shay locomotives that we're familiar with were still several years in the future, but in the summer of 1875, Shay took the first in a series of incremental steps towards the development of those now famous locomotives. In order to drive down costs, the first things to go were the sleds and the ice roads. Shay spent the summer of 1875 building a wooden tramway through his timberlands and developing a four-wheel log truck to carry the logs. Horses were still used as motive power, but this presented a problem. On downgrades, the log cars could overtake the horses, injuring or possibly killing them. The following year, Shay had a conventional side rod locomotive built for his tramway, and while this provided greater control over the movement of the log cars, the locomotive really did a number on the wooden rails, especially on curves. It was at this point that Shay made an astute observation. While the wooden tracks didn't appreciate the heavy steps of the locomotive, it seemed to hold up fine under the four-wheel trucks of the heavier log cars. Later in 1876, Shay approached William Crippen, a machinist and foundry operator in Clam Lake, Michigan, with an idea for a new locomotive. Crippen constructed a vertical boiler and a small steam engine that produced about 14 horsepower. Meanwhile, Shay took a 14-foot flat car and placed a logging truck under each end. The front truck was able to swivel, while the rear truck was rigidly attached to the frame. Crippen's steam engine was mounted crosswise over the rear truck and transmitted power to the axle via a gear reduction and a chain drive. The boiler was installed in the center, and a water tank was placed over the front truck. The result was a machine that bore little resemblance to the sidewinders that would appear 4 years later, but it worked. Since the chain drive provided constant torque to the drive wheels, and the locomotive's weight being distributed over 4 axles instead of two, this greatly reduced the wear and tear on the track. By 1878, Shay's locomotive was generating some significant savings for his logging company. He was able to drop the price of lumber from $3.50 per thousand board feet down to $1.25. Shay realized he had created a huge competitive advantage for himself. He was able to fill orders more quickly and at a lower cost than his competitors. Surprisingly, though, he had no intention of marketing his locomotive to other lumber companies and decided to keep his invention a secret. But an article appearing in the Lumberman Gazette in June 1877 let the cat out of the bag. Since Shay didn't patent his locomotive, the design was available to whoever wanted it. William Crippen found himself swamped with orders from other lumber companies, creating a backlog that would take Crippen several years to work through. Shay continued to develop ideas for improving his locomotive throughout 1878 and 1879, but eventually came to the realization that the locomotive needed an overhaul. Shay contacted the Lima Machine Works and met with George Disman to discuss his ideas and how best to complete the work. The locomotive was shipped to Lima, arriving in January 1880. Lima machinist John Carnes became deeply involved in the work on Shay's locomotive. It was Carnes who developed the concept of powering all wheels on both trucks by a line shaft mounted outboard the frame and driving the axles through bevel gears. This would become known as the Carnes design. The rebuilt locomotive featuring the driveline that has become synonymous with Shay locomotives was shipped back to Shay in April 1880. Oddly enough, of the 2,767 Shays built by Lima, this would be the only locomotive Lima would build for Shay himself. While Shay's locomotive was a combination of known technology and even some patented items, Shay discovered he could file for a patent. On March 30th, 1881, Shay was granted a patent even though Lima was already producing locomotives of Shay's design. While the patent describes a different method of attaching the engine to the drive shaft, it was determined that Shay had patented a concept rather than a complete design. In spite of this, Shay was given full rights to the design, and the patent covered locomotives being produced by not only Lima, but also the Michigan Machine Works. Shay would go on to license both builders to produce locomotives covered by his patent. The license agreement with Lima would net Shay 64 shares of Lima stock, valued at $1,000 per share, and royalties on the first 400 locomotives. The details of the agreement with the Michigan Machine Works are unknown, but they were probably similar to those with Lima, since Shay would advertise and promote the sale of Shay patent locomotives for both companies. James Henderson of the Michigan Machine Works developed a geared locomotive based on Shay's patented concept in 1882. Henderson's design placed the driveline under the locomotive to the left of center, and the engine itself was located under a horizontal boiler. Even though Henderson's design differed greatly with Shay's concept, it was still covered under Ephraim Shay's patent. Even though the Henderson Shays were more powerful, the Michigan Machine Works would only turn out 6 of what became known as the Henderson Shays before going bankrupt in 1883. After the bankruptcy of the Michigan Machine Works, Henderson would go on to work for Lima, where he would further improve the Shay concept by adding a third cylinder to the engine and a third powered truck. Unlike some other locomotive types, the Shay concept began to catch on almost immediately. Logging railroads in particular liked the geared locomotive since it could haul heavy loads up steep grades and around sharp curves over less than ideal track work. Since the trucks were attached to the frame in a way that allowed for some vertical movement, the Shays were able to take up irregularities in the rail without losing traction. And with power being applied to all axles via a drive shaft and gears, the Shay could operate under a partial slip condition. If one truck lost its grip on the rails, the wheels wouldn't spin violently, resulting in a total loss of traction. By 1911, Lima had developed a classification system for the Shay patent locomotives it was turning out. The only strict commonalities among locomotives of a given class are the number of cylinders and the number of trucks. Things like track gauge, wheel diameter, boiler pressure, and cylinder bore and stroke varied greatly among locomotives of a given class. Even the gear ratio between the drive shaft and axles was anything but standard. The Shay would go on to find applications beyond the logging industry. The locomotive began appearing in quarries, mines, plantations, and even on trunk lines of common carrier railroads. This may explain the substantial variations found among Shay locomotives, since they were built to a customer's specific needs. Furthermore, a fair number of the operators were not obligated to use track built to the American standard gauge, which is 4 feet 8.5 inches. Shays were built to a wide variety of gauges, ranging from 19 inches all the way up to 66 inches, the most popular being 24, 36, and 42-inch gauge. Surprisingly, though, these non-standard gauge locomotives only account for 35% of the 2,767 Shays built by Lima. The standard gauge Shays were not only more numerous, but some found themselves in the service of common carrier railroads. One railroad in particular, the Chesapeake and Ohio, would end up owning 14 of the 24 truck Shays built by Lima between 1903 and 1911. The Chesapeake and Ohio's neighbor, the Western Maryland, would acquire 2 in 1906. Even the Baltimore and Ohio would end up with 3 Class C Shays built between 1904 and 1912. While William Crippen and the Michigan Machine Works produced early versions of the Shay, and Lima being the longest tenured manufacturer, there was one builder that began turning out Shay variants rather late in the game. After the expiration of Shay's patents, the Williamette Iron and Steel Works of Portland, Oregon, entered the market with their own offering. Between 1922 and 1929, Williamette produced 33 geared locomotives that were basically modified Shays. 2 were of the Class B variety, while the remaining 31 were Class C. Among the most notable differences are the Williamettes were oil burners except for one that burned coal, like most Shays. While the Shays featured slide valves and Walschaerts valve gear, the Williamettes used piston valves and Stephenson valve gear. The trucks for the Williamettes were designed to provide a better ride, and while most Shays lacked superheaters, most Williamettes came equipped with them. Between Lima and Williamette Iron and Steel, nearly 2,800 geared locomotives inspired by Ephraim Shay were produced. Then there were the 6 turned out by the Michigan Machine Works and an unknown number of William Crippen examples. 6 Williamette locomotives still exist. One is operational, while Medford number 4 is being restored back to operational condition by the Southern Oregon Railway Historical Society of Medford, Oregon. The remaining 4 are on static display throughout the Pacific Northwest. As for the Lima-built Shays, 117 still exist. The oldest surviving example is serial number 122, built in 1884. Number 122 is on display at the Turtle Bay Exploration Park in Redding, California. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.